Hello and welcome to the NVR podcast number 20. I'm Rachael Aylmer.
And I'm Peter Jakob.
And today we are going to be talking about NVR in early childhood and the parental alliances. So we're talking two topics today. Peter, how did we get to this topic this morning?
Well, a parent and colleague wrote to us, and she told us a story about her own experiences, her and her partner's experiences, with their little 4-year-old daughter who was biting them, and she was biting hard. And she wrote that they communicated with Chaim Omer. They emailed Chaim Omer asking him, can you do an announcement with a little child of that age? And they decided that they were going to oppose this biting. And even before they had an opportunity to make that announcement, apparently their little daughter stopped biting, as if by magic. And this colleague and parent wondered whether there is something about the strengthening of the parental alliance that makes a difference. So that was the starting point, and I guess it was the starting point for two topics, really, because one topic is working with parents and or foster carers or carers of very young children, and the other topic is, I think, the parental alliance. And in this colleague's email, they were connected, but I think each topic can stand in its own right. I was just wondering, do you sometimes work with parents with very young children?
Yeah, I do. I've got a client currently who have a 6-year-old, and in the past I've worked with parents with a 5-year-old. So it's quite a familiar ground for me to work with. And often what comes in the training, the foundation training that I deliver to professionals is quite often what's the youngest age that we can do NVR to a child. And commonly the same question is brought up when we are discussing the announcement in the training. You know, at what's the youngest age that we could consider writing an announcement to a child? So it surprises many professionals that it can be as young as 5.
Yeah. Do you know, I just had a memory. Years ago, I was seeing a mother and her daughter. The daughter was about 7. The daughter was coming along into the session. And there was a little boy, a toddler, and the girl actually behaved quite well in the session. The mother told me that things were very difficult at home. And the toddler would come up to the mother and want her attention, and he would go about it by pounding her leg with his fists. And she looked at me and she said to me, you see, he's starting already. And he just kept pounding her with his fists. And then she took him and plunked him on her lap, facing away from her. And it was at the same time obedient to him, but also angry.
Rejected. Yeah.
And rejecting of him. So this was a 2-year-old little boy, and we talked about this, and I felt, on the one hand, the child needs attention. On the other hand, he's learned to demand attention. And the attention that he gets is not, it's not nurturing, because it is saturated with the parent's anger. And it's upsetting for the parent, because she wants a different kind of relationship to her little boy, And so we just experimented a little bit, and we were practicing NVR, because I said, how is it that you pick him up? And she said, it's just automatic. I just pick him up. And I said, what, like your hands just go out and you pick him up? She said, yeah, without thinking, but I am irritated with him. And we experimented with her sitting on her hands while he was pummeling her with his fists. And she literally sat on her hands so that she wouldn't automatically pick him up. And after a little while, he let off, and he went and occupied himself again. And I suggested to her that she shows him attention when she's ready, because you've got to be ready to do that inside of yourself, And she did, and she showed him attention very nicely. She went over to him where he was playing, sat down next to him, asked about the car buzzing around or whatever it is that you do. And then she came back and we talked some more, And then he came to show her something, and she turned around and she looked at it, and it was a lovely situation, And
it's a different interaction.
Very different. And she said, there's something I get it. She said, I can't explain what's different, but there's something different here. And we were working with NVR, we were working with her refusal to be controlled. But at the same time, we were looking at the act of reconciliation here, which was giving the child the attention that he needs, but not giving him attention to his demand for attention, to his coercive demand for attention, which results in her feeling angry and rejecting towards him. So it just occurred to me that I just had that memory of a very short instance of NVR work with a little 2-year-old.
I'm thinking quite often parents respond to their child in that way because they feel the behaviour is being witnessed by another, and so therefore I must give my child a punishment because he's being naughty. That compelled sense that parents sometimes have when their child is behaving in a way that's unacceptable and it's being witnessed by another adult. And so the greatest emotion is to punish the child for that behavior.
Or maybe in this case, she felt she needs to give him attention because the psychologist is watching her, and the psychologist probably expects her to give him attention.
Yeah.
But she didn't want to. And she wasn't ready. But I'm just thinking, so a lot of these things can play out with very young children. But in this email from this colleague, there was something about, she said that the parents decided, she and her partner decided to oppose the biting, and she wonders whether that parental alliance made a difference in that case. And of course, we haven't had more of a conversation because we don't know. Maybe we can move on to talk about that parental alliance, or sometimes it's an alliance between a parent and a supporter. And I realize we haven't really spoken about that yet on this podcast.
No, yeah, I think let's move on.
Yeah, and earlier, before we started recording, You mentioned some parents who, as many parents, have ended up becoming very obedient to their child, to their, I think it was a teenage daughter. And you mentioned the way whenever their practitioner, their NVR practitioner, suggests they could take this or that position, they respond with, yes, but then she would do this, or yes, but then she would say that. And it struck me that the child's voice was the loudest voice in the therapy room, even though the child wasn't even there. And,
For sure.
and the colleague you were supervising couldn't hear the parents' voices. So it was almost like the colleague was talking to the child through the parents, but not talking to the parents. And I was sort of visualizing those parents sitting in the therapy room, or maybe on Zoom, in the Zoom room. I was wondering what happens to them and between them at that point where the child's voice is so loud and their voices, they don't even hear their own voices.
Yeah.
What happens in the case between them?
And they're not my clients, but I get a sense of that erasure. I get a sense of them not being able to co-parent. I get a sense of them not being able to show parental authority for fear of retaliation, response, resistance from their daughter, and the impact of that, the fear that they may be feeling and sensing if they push her too hard. I don't know, will she run further away? Will they lose everything by pushing too hard? And maybe they need to hold this position because it feels safer for them than what the sense of the work that their practitioner is doing with them, which is developing change. Maybe they feel that it's not change they're developing, but they're pushing her away. I don't know.
Well, what you're describing are experiences, I guess, of what parents tell us what happens inside of their mind, what happens in the parent. What I'm not clear in my mind about yet is what happens between the parents at that point. And I'm just visualizing our colleagues' work with this family, and I'm imagining both parents looking towards the child, listening towards the child, being very vigilant, almost hyper vigilant towards what will come from the child or could come from the child, this or that, what has come from the child in the past, but not yet really engaging with each other. When I think of the parental alliance, I would imagine in order to form an alliance, the parents need to engage with each other. And something about if they can engage with each other, their voices can be heard. And I just wonder, how do we do that? How do we do that in work in NVR with parents? How do we get them to actually look at each other, listen to each other, engage with each other? How do we support that?
Well, I got asked this in supervision this week from some colleagues I supervise in Leeds. I think for a starting point, both parents need to want to know and learn from each other. They both need to want to know that they both matter to each other, that there's some co-parenting, that they have and want the same things for their child or children. That's a really good starting point. And I guess one of the sticking points in our work is that when one parent doesn't want the same thing as the other parent, there becomes a divide, and that can be a challenge to work with.
So the divide happens at a point where there's a rupture in the relationship between the parents. Because they want, when you say one parent doesn't want what the other parent wants, are you saying they don't want the same thing for the child, or they don't want to do the same thing?
Yeah, they don't want to do this.
They don't want to do the same thing. They don't want to respond in the same way, but they want the same thing for the child.
Yeah, they want the child to be safe and well developed, but they don't want to perhaps do the same things to get there.
So the rupture in their relationship happens at the point of their disagreement, how to go about it, or perhaps not even just their verbal disagreement, how to go about it, but that they actually go about it in different ways in everyday life.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what that looks like. One example that comes to my mind is when one parent says no at a certain point, and the other parent gives in at that very same point. That would just be an example. Or another one would be one parent is still very upset, and the other parent feels it's time to reconcile. And they're operating at cross purposes at that very point. And suddenly the energy goes away from resisting the problematic behavior of the child, or finding ways of reconciling with the child. And the energy goes into the disagreement and the tension and possibly conflict between the parents at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the parents end up thinking there's something wrong with their relationship, that there's some severe problem in the relationship, when actually a lot of this might be the result of them sitting in the same boat in terms of the concerns for the child and their wishes for the child, but rowing in opposite directions.
Frantically, I think sometimes.
Frantically
rowing in opposite directions. Yeah, and I think that is another addition. So not only am I a parent whose child is behaving in a way that is harmful to her, but I'm also a parent sharing the responsibility with the other parent who wants, who's doing something different to me. So that's like a double whammy of challenges.
I'm thinking of an example that Dan Dahlberger likes to tell, a little story that he likes to tell. And he was sitting with two parents, and he came up with an idea. I can't remember what the idea is. And the mother started shouting or raising her voice at Dan. And Dan said to her, "I beg your pardon." And then the mother said, No, that's what my daughter would say. So it was as if the daughter had come into the therapy room and the mother had disappeared, psychologically.
Yeah.
And at that moment, of course, then you just have the father sitting with his, in inverted commas, daughter. And the mother and his wife has disappeared psychologically. So I still want to come back to that question. That's still on my mind, because somehow we find ways to facilitate the parents to come together again, to start building an alliance where their relationship has been ruptured. And I'm still not clear in my mind how we do that, because we do that. We do it successfully. What do we do?
What do we do? I think for me, sometimes, quite often, working with the parent who is perhaps, let's use the term more pro NVR, and is beginning to adapt and utilize each principle and work with that, who then begins to see change in their relationship with the child.
Mhm.
So the child is perhaps maybe less aggressive towards that parent, or there's a stronger connection throughout the week where the parent can sit with the child for longer periods, or increase their presence and responses. And the other parent who's less active in their NVR position witnesses that. And through that witnessing comes about change in the two adults that are looking after the child. So, maybe let's use an example of a mother and a father. So the father is the let's say for the more pro parent, the mother is the least, and the mother witnesses this in the father and witnesses the father's receiving less violence or harmful behaviours, and then they want to become more involved. They want that connection that they're witnessing. They want to be like that. It's a bit like I want to come on board. I feel I have the strength to also stand beside you and work with you to support these challenges. So I think sometimes change comes about within, when one parent is really actively pursuing their parental authority and engagement with the child, and the other parent will follow naturally. I think there's a process that just happens within, and then
I remember interviewing a father, and he told me that he'd had this experience. Their daughter was in a child psychiatric inpatient ward, and the daughter would, get very, very aroused, and lose it. And she'd be up under the ceiling and shouting, screaming, hitting out, and things like that. And the nurse failed to be able to do anything about it. And the mother said to the nurse, we can just deal with it later, And she said, I've been learning about striking the iron when it's cold. And as long as she's not hitting anyone, we can let her scream and shout, and we'll deal with it later. We'll talk to her later about this. And they walked out of the room, and the father witnessed this, and he realized that his daughter calmed down much quicker. It only took a few minutes for her to come down, and actually she then approached him and her mother and the nurse and apologized, and and they decided to talk about what had happened. And he told me that he thought at that moment, my goodness, if my wife can do that, and she can do it the way he put it, better than the nurse, then I can do it too.
Absolutely.
So, in a way, his wife had become his role model. And I mean, I never got to speak to his wife, but I have wondered since what it will have felt like to her when she perceived him trying to shift so that he can come into alignment with how she's going about it. And I just thought that must have felt really good for her to notice that. And maybe they also spoke about that.
Yeah. I just had a session this morning with a client whose partner couldn't attend. So I had the whole session with the father, and he talked a lot about him talking to his wife more about his words were, using NVR responses, and how his wife is feeling quite overwhelmed with their daughter's behaviour, and that her bucket is overflowing and that she's struggling. And at times, what's really helping ground him to connect with his wife are the sessions that we're having, the language that we're using. He said it's only been X amount of sessions. I can't expect to change overnight, but I'm really practicing NVR and talking to my wife in between sessions about the session, our sessions that we have, and about our responses to our daughter and her behaviours. That the whole house is becoming more peaceful, and although his wife is experiencing that she's stretched and she feels overwhelmed and her bucket is very, very full, that actually the NVR sessions are helping them reconnect as parents, and they're becoming more attuned to dealing with the problematic behaviour from their daughter together, as opposed to separately.
I think you just said something different. Not only more attuned to dealing with the behavior together, you described him becoming more attuned to his wife. And that to me seemed, you use this image of him noticing that bucket flowing over.
Yeah.
So perhaps instead of thinking she's doing it wrong or thinking I can do it better, he's looking at her and thinking, God, this is hard for her. That's a very different position. It's an empathic position. And I'm thinking, if both parents are constantly focused on the child and focused on what the right reaction is to the child and what they can't do, they're not focusing on each other.
No.
And so when we help them to focus on each other, or when they do that spontaneously, that makes a big difference. It strikes me that we've sort of come to 3 points that are important for this parental alliance.
Yeah.
I think one point is to establish that they both have the same desired outcomes. They both want the same for their child. Only they've been going about it in different ways, and that has caused a rupture.
Yeah.
But the rupture is not on the basis of any evil intent or negligence on any one part. So that's the one element. The other element is encouraging the observance or, observation of new things or different things that a parent is doing differently in the relationship with the child, and learning to appreciate that. Oh, okay, so now he's doing it like that, or now she's doing it like that. Actually, I could try that out too. And in that way, aligning what they do. And the third thing is also hearing the voice of the other parent in their struggles. I can appreciate this is too much for you at that point. And then you try to deal with it by, I don't know, shouting, screaming, demanding, punishing, whatever it might be. But I get it. I get it that it's too much for you. And maybe this is the point where, I could step in if I feel that I can cope at this moment. What about that? So in a sense, they're building an alliance on different levels, aren't they? And I then imagine that I'm hearing the voice of the parent more, of the parents. I'm thinking of a fourth element.
Well, I'm thinking of a fourth element. That's the great minds think alike.
Oh, what's your fourth element?
My fourth element was that self-care is an absolute priority.
That was exactly my fourth element. Go ahead.
Seriously, we are. Self-care. I was talking to the dad about self-care, him recognizing what he needs to replenish, to feel nourished, so that he is able to recognize these things in his partner, his wife, and also to continue his persistence in keeping his daughter safe. But also how he might remind his wife about her own needs and what she might need. So there was a double whammy of personal self-care and also the self-care of his partner. What might she need, and how he could, and how parents can step in when the other parent is feeling overwhelmed or depleted, and holding that rope for both parents for a while until the other parent feels replenished. And so that was my fourth point.
And isn't there, I mean, where parents are also in a relationship with each other, apart from just being parents, so parents who are not separated as parents, as a couple, isn't there part of that self-care? Could that not be, when was the last time you went for a walk with the dog together and didn't speak about your child? And dare we even think, when was the last time you went out for dinner together and wore some nice clothes? Dare we even think that far in terms of self-care? So self-care can be beyond individual care, it's relational care.
Absolutely. And when our children are not presenting in a way that seems healthy, and that is overwhelming for every parent who to witness their child making choices that aren't good for them is scary and it's consuming. So just the reminder of going for a walk and not having to talk about your child's needs for a moment for half an hour is, I think, a real act of self-care. Yeah, definitely.
So relational self-care that helps build the alliance and brings eventually the parents back into the therapy room, or the voice of the parents, not just the voice of the child.
Yeah,
definitely. I think we
haven't exhausted that, Peter, because we could talk for about another 3 hours about
I don't think we've exhausted it, but I think we've started on it.
For sure, yeah. Just want to add, as we draw to a close, that we are aware our podcasts have not been fortnightly due to work commitments and hay fever, I think, could be the other culprit.
Let me mention Rachel. Rachel has been great because she's been doing this podcast today in spite of a real serious hay fever affliction. And all those hay fever sufferers and survivors out there will know what that can be like.
So if I'm talking through my nose, apologies for that.
Yeah.
Apologies for that. Okay. That was nice. I like that. I like parental union, parental alliances, but I think more importantly, it brings home the importance of self-care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.